record, and we will get started. So we are dealing with theoretical approaches to Latin American politics. The reason that we're dealing with these now, as opposed to before we studied the time periods, is because the time periods help to put in perspective the key issues and the key questions in some of the key debates as well. And it helped to put in perspective what we're actually studying when we create a theory of Latin American politics and when we think about how to theorize or how to think about Latin American politics as a whole, or in terms of something that can be interpreted or understood in a systematic way. And what you'll see over and over in this discussion that begins today and will carry on through next week is that those different themes and those different issues that arose in those time periods that we discussed are really the foundation of these theories. These theories are designed to explain those kinds of outcomes. And so the usefulness of what we did already is that it presents us with the empirical fodder for this discussion about theory. And so you'll see a lot of consistency between what we discussed today and what we've already covered in class. And that means then that, well, your familiarity with that early material will influence how you interpret and understand what we read about and discuss beginning now. And this is the point where we begin to step back a little bit and take a look at those time periods and those issues through the vantage point and through the lenses of different theories or models or approaches to those various issues as a whole. And the key question that we begin with is, how should we approach the analysis of Latin American politics? This is a question that is a little bit different from the question of how we should approach the study of Latin American politics, which related to the research methods that we use to try to understand countries or to compare them. Now we're shifting gears to those theories that we would use in combination with some research method that we might apply in the study of a few countries or many. And so now we're thinking about questions that relate to different sets of issues. Our starting point is really the same. Latin America is a complicated place with a long history. The number of country issues is staggering. We selected a set of methods for studying these issues, and those methods are the method of agreement and the method of difference. In the comparative method more generally is that method that we've set aside as useful for our purposes, studying these issues. But once we select that method, we still face the issue of how to approach analytically those issues and how to think about them and study them in a systematic way, and how to understand and interpret Latin American politics at a higher level of abstraction than we were able to achieve with those concepts in those empirical sort of sketches that we drew for those early time periods and the more recent time periods. The question is, how can we begin to understand this complicated place, even with a method? We need approaches, we need theoretical approaches and models for interpreting or trying to understand these issues. And those issues increasingly will focus on democracy and dictatorship and the quality of democracy, the strength of different democratic institutions in Latin American countries. The rest of this course, building on these theoretical approaches, will focus primarily on democracy and the strengths and the weaknesses of Latin American democracies and some of the shortcomings, but also some of the accomplishments of Latin American democracies. Now, you know already that the region has really been a profile in change because of this swinging back and forth between dictatorship and democracy. But since 1970 and 1980 and the 1990s in particular, Latin America has mainly been democratic. And so as we begin to focus on those contemporary issues, questions like the following come to the fore. And these are the questions that will relate most closely to these theoretical approaches that we're using. These questions are, for example, why has the choice between democracy and authoritarianism been central to Latin American politics, but not to US politics? Again, drawing that contrast between the regions to show the uniqueness of Latin America and so that we can understand how it's distinct as compared to a region that we may be more familiar with, the United States and North America more generally. Relatedly, why have Latin American countries suffered successive periods of de-democratization while North American countries have not? Another interesting question that obviously becomes relevant when we think about the experience of countries like Nicaragua, Venezuela, and some others recently, since 2011. What are the conditions for some form of transition from authoritarian to democratic rule in Latin America? What are the conditions for some sort of transition from democratic to authoritarian rule in Latin America? So the reverse of that earlier question. And then finally, what are the sources of institutional strength and of institutional weakness in Latin America, particularly democratic institutions like legislatures or courts, or maybe the executive or the bureaucracy? These are all questions that relate closely to the experience with democracy and dictatorship in Latin America, and especially since 1970. And so the rest of the course is a study essentially in Latin American democracy and those various issues that relate to some of the particularities of the Latin American experience, issues of corruption, patron-client relationships, relationships with the United States and whether the US promotes or undermines democracy in Latin America, these kinds of questions. And the approaches that we're going to use to assess these questions and to analyze and interpret experiences in Latin America really fall into three categories. And these are three approaches to Latin American politics that have been relatively well established and have some foundation, some firm foundation in the literature and in the debates that we have. Now, the oldest and the most well-known one, for good and bad reasons, is called the historical and cultural approach, or really the Latin American tradition, as we'll call it here momentarily. There's also a path dependency approach that's a little bit different. And then there's a set of institutional approaches that focus on questions about institutional weakness and strength and the ways that institutions can help to account for differences across time and space in Latin America in political outcomes and behavior. And the way that we'll look at these different approaches is by, first of all, looking at their main theoretical proposition. So what is the key argument? Secondly, what are the main units of analysis? What are the main instruments or the main variables that are at work in these theories? Who are the key authors who've been involved in developing these theoretical approaches? What are the main predictions created or that follow from the theory? That is, what are the testable implications of those theories? And then finally, we'll assess the main limitation of each theory. And throughout, we will relate these theories to aspects of the Latin American experience that we already know well as a result of our study of the time periods in Latin American politics. And this is where your knowledge of those time periods and the development from colonial to post-colonial to early 20th century democracy and eventually the reversal of democracy and populism, these are issues and topics that will relate closely to all of these discussions. And so I'm happy to report to you that you've done a lot of work already in this course. You're prepared to understand these theoretical approaches in a very substantial way and to use them, moreover, because of your knowledge of Latin American politics. And so there's a method to this madness, I promise. We're not just stabbing in the dark. We'll use that knowledge that you've accumulated to understand and reflect and interpret, and we'll do so in a rigorous way in this part of the course. Now, we're going to deal with the historical and cultural approach today. And this is an approach that has a very storied development that stretches back to the 60s and the 70s. And it's one that is controversial for reasons that we'll discuss, but that also is useful in some ways as well. Of course, having the limitations that it has, just in the same way that other theoretical approaches have their own limitations as well. But before we get started, I actually want to step back a little bit. And I want to turn this over to you in a way that I don't ordinarily do, but that I think is useful for our purposes. And I want you to answer this question not with some intuition about what the answer might be in line with the discussion we'll have, but in terms of what you really think, because the question that animates the debate about the historical and the cultural approach has to do with the legacies of the past and how much those legacies weigh on the present. And those legacies pertain to nation states in modern Latin American countries, but as individuals, we have legacies of our own and past experiences of our own. And the question that I want to ask you is a really general one that all of us can maybe relate to and understand the significance of, which is, can people liberate themselves from past influences? Can they free themselves from past influences? Or are we a product of where we came from? Are we determined by our upbringing? Or can we break free from past influences in a way that permits us to make choices and act independently and autonomously and to exercise and express our agency? What do you think? Can people liberate themselves from the past, or are we stuck with the legacies and where we came from? We can use the mic or we can use the chat as well, however you feel comfortable.
I think that people can definitely liberate themselves from the past. I feel like insofar as people are looking backwards, they can look towards the future and sort of make the future in their image instead of worrying about what happened before.
Okay, great. So let's continue. I'll incorporate some of the input in the chat after we hear from anyone who wants to use the mic, and I encourage anyone to take the floor who'd like to speak.
Um, I think that after a lot of time and a lot of work, people could potentially liberate themselves from past influence. You know, taking into perspective, like people individually, it takes time to come from something that has influenced you greatly. I think eventually we can initially change the product.
So what we're hearing from Ishan and Agalith is that on the one hand, Ishan points out, if we're backward looking, it may be difficult to escape those legacies. But if we look forward and set our sights, fix our gaze upon the horizon, perhaps it's possible to overcome them. Agalith adds that with time and with a lot of work, it can be possible to reach for that horizon and to escape those past influences. But I think the key that Agalith points out is that that takes a lot of work, right? It doesn't come easily, and it's often agonizing and difficult, and in really challenging, right? In ways that push us to our limits. And I think that this is the key here, because the horizon is always there, but it's always possible to look backwards as well. And there's sort of a choice involved, but if we choose to look to the horizon, it still will require us to engage in this difficult process of discovery and trial and maybe error. And I think that what we're getting at is the experience of many Latin American countries in the ways that they've had to work diligently in agonizingly to overcome some of the legacies of colonialism. And we'll discuss this in great detail as we go forward. But I want you to notice that right away, there's a clear link and kind of like analog between the experiences of ordinary people like ourselves and how we think about our lives, and whole countries who also have a past and who also have a memory and who can also make choices but may also be confronted with great difficulty, should they consciously try to overcome some of those past influences.
Professor.
Yes, Ian.
Um, I just want to say, I think that it's important to note a distinction between liberating yourself from past influences and forgetting about those past influences too, because I think that it can be a dangerous line there where, the saying, if you forget history, it's bound to repeat itself, is kind of how I feel. Like, you can take your past experiences and you can use those to reshape your future, but if you completely liberate yourself from who you are or where you came from, I think that can be very dangerous moving forward and into new generations.
Yeah, Ian. So it may be that there's kind of this like uneasy balance between like preserving the memory of who you were, and maybe seeking to become something new, right? Maybe becoming something new has to require this awareness and this memory of who you were and not forgetting. I think that's the key. And not surprisingly, the question of memory becomes really relevant in a lot of political debates in Latin America because there's a history. And the place has been described as a living museum, from human rights cases to memories of the abuse and the subjugation of indigenous communities up to the present day, of course. These memories are painful, and without doubt, improving democracy in Latin America has to involve addressing those kinds of issues. And what that means is moving forward, but not forgetting, right? And kind of striking that balance between memory and forward thinking. I think Ian's point is a really good one. What it means to liberate ourselves may not mean entirely forgetting or forgetting at all. It may mean finding a way to cope with it such that it does not define us. And maybe that's how we know how to redefine ourselves, because we don't forget what may previously have defined us. And I know that this is stuff that we can all understand and experience and relate to because we think about and experience this in our own lives. I'm sorry, I think I interrupted someone.
Oh, I'm sorry. May I go?
Yes, please, Orlando.
Okay. So I was thinking about it like of a conscious type of thought. When it comes to liberating themselves, I think about the U.S. and I compare it to like Germany. I feel like when we ask ourselves this type of question, it's like as a country and a society, are we conscious enough to allow ourselves to admit our wrongs and go on from there? And I feel like I think about it like the comparison in which Germany went out about within its time period when it was within Nazism and how they went about to approaching it and within their own country. Meanwhile, for example, the US has had, for example, we had the latest presidential debate and white supremacism was not denounced. And I mean, that's something that is of a conscious that you have to be aware of. Like your country has to have certain cultures or certain thoughts or prejudice as well that, hinder society and have been passed down. So if past influence definitely make a difference, but it's also that conscious of knowing how to go with like what Ian said, like not forgetting. It's knowing what it is and knowing how to like educate the people that of their previous history and how to go on about it. Not necessarily let it define you, but also learn from it. So it's like a learning lesson of sorts. And I feel like it's a conscious decision as a country.
For sure. And your comment, Orlando, makes me think about, that question that's sometimes debated. Does acknowledging our shortcomings make us stronger? And I personally think that it does. And some don't. Some think that it doesn't make us stronger. But to your point, it means acknowledging what happened and the influence that it may still have, but working diligently to not let it define the present. And so that, again, it's this like learning to live with the past, but while moving beyond it in the present. And it's that balance, right? In that way that that life kind of becomes like a museum where you acknowledge and recognize that experience, and you work diligently to try to correct whatever deficiencies brought about the things that you're now remembering, right, for what they are. And of course, the whole point of this is that we have got to recognize that it was a problem in the first place to be able to identify it as such. And then comes the question of whether or not recognizing that problem makes us stronger or not. And that's a political debate that whole nations have. And there's a debate in this country right now, more or less, about that question and whether acknowledging and recognizing and owning those shortcomings and those failures makes us stronger. And really, there's a debate about whether they're even failures at all. But clearly, there are sharp differences of opinion and very valid arguments that there are some real failures and some real abuses that can be seen as such and can be thought of as something to escape from while still remembering and acknowledging. And so, Orlando, your point dovetails neatly with Ian's, whose point also complements the earlier points from Ishan and Agalith. And I'm so happy to hear that you have some ideas on this, because this gets us, you'll see momentarily, to really the core underlying questions that come along with the historical and cultural approach. And those questions are questions that are still with us today, sort of ironically, after more than about a half century of this theory being in use and perpetuated by authors in the United States, less so in Latin America. But that's a separate issue. Before I tap into some of these contributions in the chat, can we hear from some more folks over the mic?
Hello.
Hi, Sarah.
Just to kind of go on the second half of the question, are we a product of where we come from? I think just as a general example that most of us know, going on today with the Black Lives Matter movement, we do see it's difficult to move on because, our system is a product of what our system used to be. So in terms of liberating yourself from your past influences, like past people have said, Ian and Orlando, they said it has to be like a balance. Like you have to acknowledge past mistakes in order to be able to liberate yourself in terms of moving forward. Another example is like cultural appropriation. A lot of people can say, in terms of liberation, maybe just let people wear whatever they want, blah, blah, blah. And then there's people who say, no, we have to acknowledge that there's, a history of racism, colonialism, stuff like that, where you have to be respectful and considerate to the past in order to be able to move forward correctly.
Yeah, so how we address the past and whether we address it adequately matters a great deal. And your example about Black Lives Matter is a good example, because there are real material inequalities in political and social that are with us and that have not been adequately addressed. And this is why Black Lives Matter has been effective in generating real debate, because it's not just those in Black Lives Matter who see those inequalities. It's a lot of people who see them and want there to be a reckoning that they don't believe has ever taken place. And so maybe this example shows us that when those influences remain with us inadequately addressed from the perspective of those who see it that way, they cannot liberate themselves. And part of liberating themselves has to be identifying those limitations and those problems and trying to rectify them and trying to bring about change that the system still has not created a place for them to create. And so these are really great examples. And the Black Lives Matter movement is analogous to the struggle for indigenous rights in Latin American countries, land rights, questions of identity and the rights of individual communities as they become more and more integrated into Latin American countries, often unitary states that grant them limited such rights. these are questions that are still with us and will be with us for some time, and maybe until they're addressed adequately. And maybe the process must begin with recognizing the problem, or the issue. And so all of these comments are great. Other comments through the mic before I tap into the chat?
I have something to add.
Yes, please. One.
So one of the things that I have noticed and like throughout the class is like throughout history we have been bound to like where we came from and where like our culture is from. So like you can like take people out of the situation that they're in and like move them to a place that's like, you know, better. And like you can like people can like redo themselves, but it still doesn't change the fact that, you know, there has been issues and those issues will follow you, you know. And it's really hard to say liberate yourself or themselves from like their past influences, because at the end of the day it's things that have affected them and will continue to affect them. And you know, maybe not directly but maybe indirectly.
Yeah, it's kind of like that Greek allegory about how you begin on one side of the river, and even though you plan to end up at a certain point on the other, when you cross the river, like the current will change your trajectory and you'll wind up in a different place than you could have predicted. And the point is to say that those things that you experience change you in ways that may be irreversible. And those changes then impact other things, right? And can you ever really free yourself or ever really depart from that? Unless you can reverse course, it may be that the cat's out of the bag, so to speak, right? Like it's something that happened and that is with you. This is maybe how we can understand the effort in some medical circles to erase memories from the minds of people who've been deeply traumatized and who've been badly affected by experiences that stay with them and that have changed their trajectory and that are irreversible experiences, barring maybe whatever medical intervention is supposed to exert that effect. But Juan, I think you're right to suggest that, well, unless you can take it back, how couldn't it still influence you? And what does it mean to liberate yourself from that? Does that mean living with it? Or does that mean breaking from it and forgetting about it? To Ian's point, when he suggested that we cannot forget about it, and maybe in that regard, liberating yourself from that is not an accurate assessment unless we change our understanding of what we mean by liberate. But another excellent point, and I'm so happy to hear from you, Juan. Thank you. Other contributions to the mic before I go to the chat?
Yes. I see liberation as you learn from what you have experienced, and you choose to either be better or bitter. So to change or to become better, you add something to society. But if you become bitter, you hurt yourself and society. So you either take the experience and let it make you better or bitter, but that's up to you to decide. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And the only thing I would ask is say that part of what we're trying to get over is a experience of repression or abuse at the hands of authorities. Is it possible for us to choose to escape that, or to move away from that in a way that helps us be better members of society? What if we're affected by that in a way that prevents us from having a choice about how it might affect us? Is that possible?
It's hard, but it's doable. In my church community, we have police officers in our church. So we have like breakouts where they talk to us about what goes on, and we understand there are good officers and there are bad officers. So when you get to talk to officers and understand every officer is not a bad officer, it's like with society. You have bad apples in every area of society, but you can't judge them all by the actions of a few. But you have to be cautious. especially in the Black community now. I don't have children, but I have nephews. And I'm afraid for them to go out, even though we have one in North Carolina in college, in, university, and we have another one that's about to go to a university. But it's every time they go out to the store, it's scary because we don't know what type of officer they may encounter. So it's hard, but it's doable.
That's a very nuanced take, Deleonore, and I'm so happy to hear from you. And I think that you're onto something, and it's a question that does involve, issues of great difficulty. And I like too that you made the point to say that there's a choice involved, because it's important for us to remember that we have agency and that we can make choices, and that it may not define us if we are able to find it within ourselves to have the power to address it, right, in a way of our choosing. And I like that was part of your response. Christian says, no, we can't cut ourselves off from our past. We are a product of it. But just because we are influenced by it doesn't mean we can't use it to be better than it and change the future for others. Yeah, Christian. So maybe like what we influence, what we experienced helps us to know how to make something better. And maybe that's how we know which direction to take the system. Alondra says, I think that we can liberate ourselves to an extent, because though we can break free from the past, it still has an impact on you, whether consciously or not. Yeah, and I think that the question of conscious versus subconscious influences is an interesting one too, because, for example, I can think of when in the late 1980s, moderate left parties in Chile were opposed to limiting the benefits given to the military during the negotiations to transition to democracy. And the reason they were opposed to limiting those benefits is because they were concerned that if they weren't nice to the military, that the military would either stay in power or seize power again. But it wasn't always clear that that was what was motivating them, and it was sort of subconscious. And it came out later that, of course, many of them had been exiled, and many of them had been badly affected by the regime in the repression. And those subconscious influences matter a great deal in politics. Of course, it's difficult to measure that, right, and understand that because it's subconscious. Deleonore says people can liberate themselves from the past, but it takes determination and hard work, a change of mindset, environment, and associations. So, complementing Deleonore's point that they made over the mic, Juan says, I think that it can be possible to liberate people from their past influences, but then again, you can take someone out of a bad place, but that does not mean that the place they were in before will affect them moving forward. Yeah, so there could be other factors, right, Juan? Maybe there are interventions or new experiences that can set us off on a new path and that can help to eradicate the influence of some previous set of influences. And
just add on to it real quick.
Please, Juan.
So one of the things that I guess I can say further my point is like if let's suppose that like someone grew up in a place where it was like predominantly like full of racist people, and like they move out of that place because they understand that it's something that is bad within society, like to be to be racist, but they move forward and they try to like remove themselves from the situation. That doesn't mean like that they're not inherently racist, because that could mean, you moved yourself out of a place to not be racist, but that doesn't mean that your ideals haven't changed, because you could change yourself, but you can't change the way you talk or act around people who you feel you have to show a persona to fit in.
Yeah, so this is a good example, right? Like, brings up questions about how much change is necessary, or is it possible that no amount of change can correct the course, so to speak, right? In terms of like trajectories. And I think that we'll see this again and again when we discuss some of these theories and the experiences in Latin America, because time and time again, countries transitioned to democracy and then they reverted back to authoritarian rule. And the question always seemed to be, when will Latin American countries be able to shake this demon? And that was often the way it was viewed, because authoritarian rule was viewed negatively, and we know why, because of the violence and the repression that often followed. But Juan's point is one that reminds us that some changes may not be sufficient, even in the midst of these heroic efforts that we may undertake to try to sort of depart from that past experience and free ourselves. Patia says, I feel like it is a little bit of both, depending upon some circumstances. Some communities don't have the resources to achieve certain goals in order to liberate oneself, but I do believe some people can liberate themselves from past influences. Yeah, so there could be some mix, right? And is it ever possible to dispense with the past? And then what is maybe the balance between the past influences and the ones that we try to surround ourselves with today, or that we try to bring about today? That's a question that comes up time and time again as we deal with with history, in process, in time, all the things that we've dealt with already. Maricela says, I think that depends on the resources that people have available to liberate themselves from past influences. It might be easy for just one individual to change their past, but when it comes to politics, it's hard. We have seen this in the US. We are still judged by what this country has done to other countries, and it has not always been easy for us to change the opinions of others. Yeah, so when politics is involved, it's excruciatingly hard, right? Because the sad truth is that there are very strong interests that benefit from these repressive systems that we're trying to reform and overturn and dispense with. Why do you think those systems exist? They exist because they're very beneficial to certain actors who are not just benefiting from them, but who are in a position to keep them in place. And so politics is a tremendously hard nut to crack. And some systems have been called unreformable for these kinds of reasons, because of how well positioned the beneficiaries are to obstruct change. And Latin America is another example that we'll see it time and time again as we talk about democratic reform and the effort to develop these societies and strengthen institutions. Abby says, I think it's very difficult to liberate from past influences because over time, these influences help form the basis of things like our own morals, ethics, way of thinking, etc. I think this is why it's very difficult for people who grew up surrounded by certain political stances have a hard time changing their opinions in the future. And Abby completely agrees with Ian, who made a point about the balance between not forgetting and how in surrounding ourselves with new influences and what that means when it comes to the question of liberation, and whether liberation involves remembering in a way that helps us to not repeat the past. Christian says, I agree with Ian on this. Ian has made a very compelling point to many students. Francisco says, I think it's sort of a 50-50. They're saying that people are a product of their environment. It could be different for people like us being the current generation. And that kind of includes me. I'm a young millennial. We grew up in a time where we see our parents' lifestyles and how they think with today's society and issues. For the younger generation, it's easier to break cycle and liberate ourselves. But when we have examples, older people or our parents, it's harder for them because it's all they've known their entire life. For sure, right? Like time is an issue. And what you'll see when we discuss path dependence is that each step in a particular direction can make it more difficult to reverse course because there are increasing returns, there are cognitive biases that deepen, and there's a lot of momentum, so to speak, right? It gets hard to kind of stop the train, and the tracks are already in place, and so that process tends to repeat itself. Alejandra says, I think our past definitely shapes who we are, but it should not define us, and there is always room for change if people are not content with their previous decisions. They can keep them in mind, like Ian said, to fuel their determination for change. This will be challenging, but it can be done. Yeah, and remembering those past influences becomes critical, right? Because we have to know what we're departing from, and so it's that uneasy balance, right, between not forgetting but not letting it define us as we redefine ourselves. And again, that question of irreversibility, right? Like we can't reverse what happened. It changed the course of our lives and our development, just as the river changes our course, and so inevitably it becomes a matter of redefining ourselves within within a kind of path or set of options that has already been delimited by what happened before us. And just in kind of a logic kind of sense, it's hard to escape that, even as we try, we can kind of break from it. Abby says, yeah, I agree, Professor. I think we have to address past influences in order to move forward. Delanor says, yes, it makes you stronger when you can acknowledge your past. Juan says, ironically, in today's politics, due to the president allowing racism to be alive, when Obama was president, these racism were underlying, and with the president allowing them to have the room to show their true colors. That's why they would continue to vote for him, because he allows racism to happen. So Juan is engaging the question of the public conversation about race and racism, and whether we acknowledge what happened in the past for what it was. And let's be honest, Trump has said that acknowledging our failures, or even calling them failures or shortcomings, is weakness. And he says, moreover, that we should not do that, and that that's rubbish. But a more nuanced or more sophisticated take might be, let's learn from what we experienced and accept it for what it was, but not let it happen again. And let's allow ourselves to strengthen ourselves through recognizing that and acknowledging that. Joel says, as a nation, I think we can shift influences with policy changes and setting up fundamentally different trajectories. It takes a lot of people to create a common consensus and a lot of bills and costs. As individuals, it takes a lot of mental strength and hard work. We need to really work towards the liberation and change important decisions. We are a product of our past, yet ideas in our situation can transform our future if others agree with the vision. Yeah, so politics becomes, it's a question of consensus building, and we create coalitions in order to share in the mutual benefits of these changes, and moreover to depersonalize it and expand the radius of the support, and so that we can share in this new future, and so that we can design it together. But that's precisely why it's so difficult, because the beneficiaries of the existing system are in a better position and have an advantage because they have a head start. And so what we have to overcome is that opposition. And that consensus building often has to involve changing the minds of many of those who benefit from the system. And so everything we've discussed, I love these conversations because we're getting to the human dimension of politics. And that dimension is too often forgotten in theories and in analytical discussions about causes and the sources of change. Well, what are we changing? We're changing our lives, right? We're trying to change the system that we live under. And this discussion brings us to the Latin American tradition. And this is a grand sort of body of theoretical perspectives that all fall under what we would call a historical and cultural approach. And these perspectives and this tradition has some underlying assumptions. All theories have assumptions that have to be true in order for the theory to be true. But the assumptions that relate to this tradition all relate to what we just talked about and the sort of influence of past events and past experiences. And I'm telling you right up front, right off the bat, the Latin American tradition believes that past influences do define us, that those past influences are inescapable, and that we can't really break free from them, and that they determine our course of development. And so these theoretical assumptions play out in the following way. First and foremost, there's the assumption that different nations and regions have different histories and cultures. The theory relies on this first idea, and that those differences become important when it comes to the ways in which different nations and regions can or cannot change over time in ways that we might call desirable, like through democratization or development or so on. Secondly, cultural responses are learned and ingrained and persist and spread beyond the time period or group that gave rise to them. This is the second assumption, and this one is a little bit more cutting, because clearly this one is saying that from the get-go, these cultural responses and these kinds of ways that we're influenced by these original circumstances, we learn them and we ingrain them, and then they persist and they spread beyond and they persist throughout time, and we become more or less enslaved by them, and we become a product of them. And in this regard, culture shapes and limits the range of our behaviors and our options at any given time or place, the cultural responses that we engage in and that stem from our histories and our cultures create limits on our behavior and create clear boundaries, so to speak, that may prevent us from changing or evolving or modifying the system. And then finally, the idea that culture and patterns and behavior become embedded in practices that then become independent variables in their own right. And that is to say that they become causes. They become causes that can prevent change or cause the persistence of systems that were brought about during an earlier period. This is a tradition that's all about the persistence of cultural responses that originate at this early point in time. And the propositions that follow from these assumptions and these ideas, the key theoretical proposition is that the political tradition in a modern state, in a state today, a contemporary Latin American state, explains the political institutions and the behavior in that state. And based on this core proposition, the historical and the cultural approach looks for the cause of different political outcomes in the nature of the dominant political tradition in a given state. Now, you're probably already asking, well, what are the possible political traditions and where do they come from? That's the next essential question, right? Because remember that those past influences came from somewhere and they originated somewhere. And so we'll talk about what that means. What that means is that the dominant tradition is closely related to the principles upon which the state was founded. So when that contemporary modern state originated, whenever and wherever it did, well, we know where it did, what was the political tradition? What was in place? What was the set of cultural and kind of traditional values that were in place at that time? This tradition focuses a great deal on those early influences in the way in which they create constraints on future behavior, in the way in which they persist and are reproduced and influence our behavior and really ultimately kind of hold us back, so to speak, or prevent us from veering off course. And so what are those founding principles? Those founding principles relate to things that you already recognize from our empirical discussion in this course. And these things relate to, first and foremost, the type of landholding system. And bear with me here, this is going to be a little abstract, but we need to identify these categories so that we know what we mean by founding principles. So we mean, did landholders control land freely, like in the United States and New Zealand or Australia and Canada? Or did they control land in return for rendering labor and services to some landed elite, like an aristocratic elite? That would be feudalism. We know about political regimes, and the question here is, was power centralized in the hands of one or a few people, as in a dictatorship, or was it dispersed among many more people in some form of democracy or another? This is the second founding principle. The third founding principle is the economic policy. Was policy designed to promote wealth acquisition by a colonizer? That's a mercantilist economic policy. You know that from previous lectures. Or was it designed to promote the development of the colony itself? This is the settler economic policy that we often associated with, well, North America, but we'll get to that later. And then finally, there was a fourth founding principle that mattered a great deal to this approach, and that is the class structure of the society. Was society divided into a hierarchical two-class system, or was it divided into a system with a large middle class? And these different categories and these different dimensions or founding principles, if you will, come together to sort of distinguish between traditions that are either authoritarian or liberal. Now, you may be saying this is so broad and primitive, and it really is, but these are ideal types. And when we create theories, we create ideal types so as to capture this sort of big picture, right? We want to see the forest, not the trees. It's like a map. You don't put every little rock on a map. Instead, you put only the big features that really stand out, so to speak. And that does paste over some of the uniqueness, but it brings out those defining characteristics. And so we have then these two political traditions, the authoritarian tradition and the liberal tradition. And they differ in terms of those different founding principles across the landholding system, the political regime, the economic policy, and the middle class. And so authoritarian traditions are feudal in that those who control land must pay or render labor or services to an elite in exchange for controlling that land. A dictatorial political regime where power is concentrated in the hands of one or a few. A mercantilist policy that's designed to benefit a colonizer. And the absence of a middle class and the existence of a very hierarchical two-tiered elite and then lower class system. A liberal tradition, on the other hand, is going to involve what we call freeholders or landowners who own their land and don't have to pay or render labor or services to an elite in exchange for controlling and using that land. Democracy, or the dispersion of power more widely among at least some group of the populace. Remember that we're talking about early history, and so, well, early modern history. So that meant something different. Often it meant democracy for white landowning men, not everyone else. So keep that in mind. But nonetheless, that is a distinction between a dictatorship, which characterizes the authoritarian tradition. The liberal tradition also involves settler policies that are designed to benefit the colony itself, as opposed to the colonizer, and then the presence of a middle class. And these two ideal types help us to begin to distinguish between the Latin American experience and the North American experience. And again, we're sort of drawing these large, broad distinctions so that we can understand those distinct, unique characteristics of Latin America, and so that we can see them in comparison to something unlike Latin America in the ways that we're highlighting here. And so we know about the Latin American experience. We know that Latin America was colonized and settled in the 16th century, and that from the beginning, it had authoritarian states, feudal landholding systems, forced labor, a mercantilist economic policy, a very rigid two-class system without a large or a solid middle class, an education system that was often based on memorization and logic that would be considered unscientific, at least according to the standard of the time. And I know that we can debate, the sort of relativism of some of what this means, but for the purpose of the theory, we're gonna take it on its face, what it says, and this is the theory's interpretation of Latin America. And finally, religious absolutism in the form of church domination and an orthodoxy that really buttressed state power. Latin America is a prototypical authoritarian tradition, according to this approach. The historical and cultural approach, the Latin American tradition, views Latin America as an example of an authoritarian tradition. And we can debate that, and we will debate that, and we will scrutinize and critique that, and you'll see how. But for the purposes of the theory, this is the sort of interpretation of Latin America. These are those early influences with which Latin American societies are reckoning, and that they are seeking to escape from or depart from or overcome. Now, the bottom line is that in Latin America, the conquistadores sought to recreate in the New World the feudalism, the authoritarianism, the religious dogmatism they carried over from medieval Europe. That was where it came from. And so that authoritarian tradition did not come from Latin America. In fact, although many indigenous societies and the most advanced ones did use forced labor and had stratification, the truth is that this authoritarian tradition came from Europe. And so keep that in mind. Now, the big takeaway is that the historical and cultural approach says that modern Latin American states have to overcome this legacy on the path to development. This is the set of influences that they have to escape, and that they have to depart from, and that they have to overcome and vanquish in this struggle to develop their democracies and strengthen their institutions in ways that serve, the broadest possible radius of people. The question arises. Have Latin American states overcome this historical and cultural legacy? And what I'll put to you is that it's a mixed record. We'll see that there are some clear examples that don't seem to fit with this interpretation, but there's also quite a bit of evidence that authoritarianism, dogmatism, and sort of orthodoxy or traditional values, if you will, have sometimes trumped democratic values, or this kind of liberalism that maybe we associate. That's big L liberalism, by the way, not small L liberalism, that we sometimes associate with the other tradition. Now that brings us to the other tradition, which is the liberal tradition. And the historical and cultural approach distinguishes between Latin America and North America in terms of the difference between authoritarian and liberal traditions. And again, we may disagree or dispute this characterization for good reasons. But on its face, this is the nature of the theory, and this is the interpretation. And so we're going to take it on its face, and we'll deal with that in stride and critique that eventually. But for now, let's take it for what it says. Now, the truth is that, very different from Latin America, North American modern day contemporary North American nation states were colonized and settled in the 17th century by settlers who were fleeing feudalism, absolutism, and oppression. They were trying to get away from precisely what the Spaniards in particular were carrying with them to Latin America. And so these settlers were very different. They weren't trying to duplicate that European medieval system. They were trying to escape it. And so in some sense, they were already trying to escape those past influences. And maybe in this regard, they were able to do so in a way that relates to our discussion earlier. But the North American experience was different from Latin America, because it's true that the United States was ruled by the British Crown, but it had representative assemblies, and the assemblies had power. And this was supportive of representative government in a way that absolute monarchy in Latin America was not. And moreover, land was owned freely by, well, at least white men. And I say at least because I'm saying that was right and upstanding, but because that was different than the Latin American experience, where it was a feudal economic system in the sense that land could be controlled in exchange for the rendering of labor or services. Not in the United States. Land was freely owned and controlled by small-time owners, or at least what were then small-time owners. There was a large middle class, and it was religiously pluralistic, and it was educationally and legally inductive, and it was more scientific in the sense that there was more sort of rigor and kind of more creativity and interpretation, as opposed to the often very primitive and kind of inflexible deductive reasoning that was often itself a product of religious dogmatism or ideas that were at odds with science. And so very different traditions. And the bottom line is that in North America, no feudal and absolutist past or institutions had to be overcome on the path to modernity. Instead, the United States was basically born free, as one historian put it. And this meant then that in the United States, there was no set of early influences from which to escape. In contrast, it was really the opposite situation, where it began with a set of institutions and influences and legacies that could be very well reproduced fortuitously and favorably from the perspective of this approach. In the Latin American experience then was very different than the North American experience. And this approach views these differences and these sort of cultural and historical sort of starting points as deeply consequential because of its views about the ways that culture reproduces itself and then determines behavior. And I want to go back to that and really emphasize that. Remember that the approach emphasizes first and foremost the sort of staying power of culture and the way in which it determines outcomes and puts limits on acceptable or behavior, or creates boundaries that create limits on our choices. Now, let's critique this perspective. It's true that the perspective does a nice job tying the possibilities for change to structural conditions. Many of you pointed out that those structural conditions or those early experiences do have some influence, and that even if we seek to escape them, they're kind of always with us. The historical and cultural approach gets that. It gets that idea. And it agrees with you if you're of the mind that those are often more difficult to escape than not. But it does so at a significant cost. There are quite a few weaknesses here. By focusing almost entirely on structure and culture, it ignores political actors altogether. Those of you who said that individuals have choices and that they can respond to the environment in a way that they choose, your view is not represented well by the historical and cultural approach. Your view is at odds with this approach because it ignores the capacity of actors to choose. And really, it implies that actors have no free will, that people, living, breathing people, can't freely choose and cannot act and cannot independently put themselves in the world and change the world. And in that way, it's too deterministic because it leaves no room for free will. On an empirical basis, it can't explain, for example, why some countries have long democratic histories, like Chile, Uruguay, and Costa Rica. Chile and Uruguay both had military dictatorships. Chile's was very repressive, but the truth is that those countries otherwise had very long democratic histories. Why? Doesn't the authoritarian tradition predict these Latin American countries having a very difficult time developing into democracies? Why would it be that some of these countries have had so much success? It just doesn't seem to be consistent with the theory. On a similar level, it doesn't distinguish between the fates of different kinds of colonies. As I'll show you in a moment, not all colonies were equally important to Spain or Portugal. In fact, some of them were what we would call backwaters, where these early institutions and early values were never really that well consolidated. And in fact, there was kind of a political vacuum, so to speak. But the theory is not nuanced enough to account for that. And we'll see how that works here in a moment. And then finally, it assumes that all Latin American states were mainly mercantilist colonies. That was actually not true. We're somewhat guilty of this in this course as well, because I did present Latin American experiences as mainly characterized by the desperate search for ways of escaping mercantilism in the way that it prevented manufacturing. But some Latin American states didn't actually fall under mercantilist policy to the same degree as others. And so first and foremost, let's point out the most important limitation of the approach, which is that there is no role for human agency whatsoever in this approach. Structural conditions inherited from the past do all the work. All the work. Everything is overdetermined. Everything originates at some early point in time and is then channeled through cultural reproduction that takes place over the course of centuries. But remember that politics is the activity through which people themselves create, alter, or sustain the rules. So why would we exclude people from the analysis? It just doesn't make any sense, right? It's like focusing on one half of the picture and then ignoring even a minimal role for people in kind of interpreting or interacting with the structures that they inhabit or overcome or seek to. In most troubling of all is the political implication that follows from this, which is that a theory stuck in the past leaves no hope for humans alive today to actually improve things now or to change the trajectories imposed by inheritance. And so this is the most troubling thing of all, because theories are not just analytical, they're also political, and the implications that they carry regarding how we should approach the world. If it really is true that everything is culturally determined and that it originates at some early point and that history and culture reproduce themselves, well, then what's the point of even trying? Why should we have any hope at all? And this is the implication that we draw from this theory, because it is stuck in the past and it does focus on the limits and the boundaries as opposed to the possibilities for change. And I want to go back and point out that it's kind of ironic to use the term possibilities for change, because there really are very few possibilities, if any, for change, because everything is determined by those circumstances and those principal kind of founding conditions, if you will. Now, I also want to point out something else. The cultural and historical approach basically treats all Latin American countries as the same in terms of their colonial experience. But there were some Latin American countries like Argentina, Uruguay, and Venezuela that were not most extensively colonized during the mercantilist era, but during the Bourbon era. And why is that important? Because remember that the Bourbon era was liberal. Remember that this involved introducing some reforms, some representative assemblies, and it involved minimizing the sort of authoritarian kind of monarchical rule that characterized that early mercantilist period. And so countries like Argentina, Uruguay, and Venezuela really were unimportant during the mercantilist period, but very important during the liberal period in terms of how extensively they were colonized. But obviously, those countries are viewed as just the same as all these others by the theory, but they're not the same because their colonial experience was not what the theory says it was. And so, what happened here? Could it be that Uruguay has a better outcome in terms of its democratic development because it never really fell under the spell of mercantilism and it was more liberal from the the 1700s during the period when it was most extensively colonized? It's possible. And it's also the case that even those who were colonized mainly during the mercantilist period were not colonized to the same degree. Some of these listed on the right were only lightly colonized. So for example, the mercantilist periphery, these are all countries where Spain and Portugal did not extensively colonize, did not extensively lay down institutions or extensively engage in colonization. And what that meant then is that these countries should have had different outcomes than those countries that were most extensively colonized during the mercantilist period. So what then happened? Why is it that some of these countries that were in the mercantilist periphery are examples of some of the weaker democracies in Latin America? Could it be that early experience and cultural influences are at some point vanquished by other factors that might bring down democracy or affect the outcome? What I want to establish and put to you is that the historical and cultural approach ignores all of this variation. All of this variation is lost on that approach because the approach relies on this kind of broad brushing of Latin American experiences and treating them as all equally vulnerable to those early extractive, mercantilist, authoritarian influences. And I think that the point here is to say that it's too convenient to treat all of these experiences as the same. And the variation between these countries and their experiences becomes quite important. And when we acknowledge that some of them were actually more heavily colonized during the liberal period and therefore had more liberal institutions, it then becomes difficult to explain, say, democratic undevelopment in El Salvador or Honduras by reference to that set of early influences. It becomes harder to sustain the theory. And this is really the challenge. And we don't have much time left. But what I wanted to ultimately come back to is this question of how much those early influences matter. And if countries, whole countries themselves, can escape those influences, or if those early influences need not necessarily be escaped because maybe they don't matter as much as the theory says they do. And really the question is, how important of a factor are history and culture in Latin American politics? Is it true that these early cultural influences and historical influences are reproduced? Is it true that they create such rigid boundaries and limits on human action? Is it true that we can't break free from those influences and that we're stuck in the past? These are questions that are vitally important to how we think about politics and the kinds of actions that we take as we try to create or alter or sustain the systems and the rules that we bring about. And then secondly, the question that I would ask you is as well, and I want to return to these on Wednesday when we get back together, is how else can you critique this historical and cultural approach to Latin American politics? What else besides what I pointed out is there for the taking when it comes to critiquing this approach? And these are questions that I'll let you kind of mull over and think about in between now and Wednesday. But I want to tell you that had such a good time, and I'm feeling so fulfilled after the discussion that we had. Like, that was a great conversation that connected all these themes and got us really thinking about the human dimension and about the political implications of different theoretical ideas. And that's just really what we want to do in a class like this, because the human dimension is inescapable in Venezuela and elsewhere. And so thank you for that conversation. I'm going to do my best to try to create more questions like that and get us thinking along these lines in similar ways as we go forward. But that does conclude today's lecture and discussion. And you're free to go. You can stick around and ask me questions or make comments if you want, but I will stop the recording. And thank you so much for being here. I'll see you next time.